Marc, I don't know if you want to say anything else as far as opening comments, but why don't you take things forward here to our first slide and our polling questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jerry, for the introduction. I'm excited to have been invited to speak at the REMS Virtual Summit today. I thank Jerry for extending the invite to me. It's nice to see many friendly and familiar names on the participants list, as well as some new ones. And as Jerry mentioned, for those that don't know me, my name is Marc DeLuca. I'm the U.S. Risk Management Lead at Sanofi. And I'm not sure about Jerry, but I'm super excited to be pulling in this dreaded after lunchtime slot. So I don't want to be too sluggish, so I decided to forego my barbecue lunch, but I hope everybody had an opportunity to refresh and are ready to go. So before we kick off here, I just want to give a reminder, it's our disclaimer here, that the views expressed by the presenters are their own and should not be attributed to their employer. And so with the lunch and disclaimers out of the way, let's kick off. The purpose of today's presentation is to highlight the importance of fostering and maintaining positive relationships and contracts between sponsors and service providers to ensure patient safety and compliance goals for our REMS programs. We do have looks like the polling question is on the screen. If we can just hold off on that one moment, we'll get back to that. But as many of you have seen, we're going to be asking you some questions here momentarily. So we're here to talk about maintaining and fostering and maintaining positive relationships between sponsors and service providers to ensure patient safety and our compliance goals for REMS programs are met or even exceeded. And as you can imagine, there are many factors that go into the decisions to engage with a third-party service provider to perform these activities in-house. These factors may include, but aren't limited to, our organization's capabilities, the resources or lack thereof resources, the complexity of our REMS programs to address our patient safety needs. Additionally, innovations in technology that can be applied to REMS continue to evolve, and these technologies have the ability to improve our stakeholders' REMS experience, improve their knowledge related to the important risks we're trying to manage, change or establish behaviors that reduce risk, minimize stakeholder burden, and maintain and provide access to patients to important therapeutic options. And so it is important to understand that sponsors and service providers that do end up partnering together on REMS programs may have different objectives, such as financial, regulatory, and compliance, to name a few. But at the end of the day, we share a common goal, and that's patient safety. So how do we navigate these different objectives to accomplish our patient safety goals while meeting the independent and often disparate needs of sponsor and service providers? I have been fortunate enough to experience both sides of the equation, both as a service provider and as a sponsor. And we're going to discuss how to build trust and positive partnerships. And Jerry mentioned this earlier, but the emphasis today is on partnership and how we use a partnership to accomplish our REMS goals in a mutually beneficial way. So before we begin with the main presentation, we have a few polling questions. So polling question number 1. Do you currently or have you previously engaged with service providers to support your REMS programs? I'll give everybody a moment here to vote, and then we'll have a quick discussion. And the results are in. Overwhelmingly, it looks like a great majority of participants have voted yes to engaging with service providers to support REMS programs. For those of you that have not, maybe this will push you in that direction. Who knows? All right. And then our second polling question for today, for those of you who have worked with service providers, how would you have gauged your satisfaction with their current or their previous performance? And we have 4 options here. The vendor or the service provider consistently met expectations. They're generally meeting expectations with some issues, resolutions needed, struggling to meet expectations, or not meeting your expectations. Well, great. It looks like for the most part, a majority of us have positive experiences. It's almost unimaginable. I wish I was part of that group A of not having any issues with vendors, but I will have to admit that I may have been the cause of some of those issues. I'm not innocent, but I may have also been possibly the solution. And for those of you that that are over here and struggling to meet expectations, maybe there's some pearls of wisdom, nuggets here that we can share to help maybe bridge the gap between the current, your current expectations and enhance future performance of your service providers.
Yeah. And Mark, maybe before we go forward, the one thing I would probably add, and I think that polling data was certainly helpful to have a better sense of where our audience is in terms of this evolution and journey of working with service providers. Certainly, we've had the opportunity to work primarily with shared REMS programs. And so I think, it's very likely that those that indicated that they haven't yet worked with service providers, or maybe they're still considering that as part of their evolution in their journey, maybe those that have private REMS programs that aren't yet working in the single shared environment. But I do think that the lessons and the information we're going to share today will hopefully be applicable to all.
Fantastic.
Okay.
We need to jump to, I think we're here now.
Yep.
There we go. All right. As most of us are, or all of us are likely aware, the goals of our REMS programs are to reestablish the benefit risk profile of pharmaceutical and biological products to ensure patient safety while providing access to the products that may not necessarily have a path to market. The spectrum of REMS programs can vary from simple communication plan only REMS that raise stakeholder awareness of the risks associated with the product use to the more complex elements to assure safe use, or ETASU REMS, that may require special education and training, certification and enrollment of our stakeholders, documentation of safe use conditions, and restricted distribution. And so REMS are developed and implemented and ultimately operationalized to ensure the safe use of our products. And to do this, we must identify the best methodologies to apply to the care delivery process to minimize risk while continuously exploring how to adapt and apply new technologies and tools to manage our REMS needs. Today's status quo may not be adequate to address tomorrow's patient safety challenges. We need to remain agile and open-minded to change, even if change is difficult. So what is the value of engaging with a service provider for your REMS needs should you have one? Like most of life's questions, that depends, and the answers will vary from sponsor to sponsor based on our company's experiences, resources, and needs. There are many opportunities throughout the REMS process to engage with service providers. These include, but are not limited to, the REMS consulting and regulatory document development, project management office services, REMS administrators, knowledge, attitude, and behavior surveys to assess our stakeholders' knowledge of the important risks and how to manage them, REMS assessment reporting, which is critical for the FDA to understand how our programs are performing, stakeholder audits, as well as non-compliance management. So we discussed the what. Now we will discuss the why of the value of partnering with a service provider. Similar to the what question, this depends on the service provider and the services they'll be providing. Ideally, service providers would be providing focused subject matter expertise in a particular area, such as IT-related items associated with REMS databases, longitudinal or institutional knowledge from working on a variety of programs, dedicated resource allocation, and the ability to scale up or scale down based on the program's needs, which is often the crux or the primary issue that many sponsors find themselves in when they're managing their REMS programs. How do we scale up or scale down and dedicate resources when that all takes time to do? So that's part of the why, or the why we are looking at our service providers. So what are the expectations of the sponsor-service provider relationship? Again, it depends on what side of the fence you're on. For all engagements, contracting is the underpinning of our sponsor-service provider relationship, as our contracts legally bind us to the terms of our engagement. If you don't believe that, go talk to your legal department and they'll make it perfectly clear what our contracts do. Successful contracting requires many factors to be taken into consideration, including contracting terms, service level agreements, resources, cost of service, feedback from our internal stakeholders, and our return on the investment. Drafting a de novo contract that meets all of our needs for a new program or an existing REMS program for anyone, including, and I'll speak for myself here, is a daunting task. At least for me, every REMS contract I've been involved in has had its own very own distinctions. It is often joked about in our industry, if you've seen one REMS program, you've seen one REMS program. Now that may sound very generalized. However, differences can arise from product to product, risk to risk, stakeholder to stakeholder. And while we would like to believe there are turnkey solutions to REMS, we often find ourselves in situations where programs just don't fit inside a standard mold. There are also barriers to successful engagement, such as lack of understanding related to our stakeholders, or how our stakeholders will ultimately interact with our systems, processes and procedures, the complexities of sharing sensitive information with our service providers or between service providers, or providing all of the needed background documentation, and this is just based on the sheer volume of it, that is required to provide a clear picture of our needs. However, the sponsor-provider relationship must transcend this transactional model to create a partnership to gain trust, open channels of communications to share the good, the bad, and the ugly, and ongoing vigilance for continuous quality improvement. In today's digital age, communications, including those that are most important to us, can be reduced to quick handoffs of events, times, and tasks. We need to step away from that transactional mindset and really begin to understand what our colleagues are feeling to begin fostering these strong relationships. Understanding how people are feeling can go a long way in better understanding what is going on the other side of the fence. In short, empathy can go a long way when building these relationships. And with that being said, at this time, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jerry so he can share his perspectives from the service provider side of the equation. So Jerry, at this time, the floor is yours.
Mark, thanks so much. And I seem to be stuck in terms of my ability to advance the slide. So if I could maybe, okay, thank you. So Mark, thanks for taking us through this opening part of the presentation. And as you mentioned, we do believe that this is a partnership model, and there are interests interests. There are interests that sponsors have. There's interests that service provider have, and there are shared interests. And that's probably where I want to start is when we get involved in a program, and I believe when many other companies that provide services for REMS programs, when we get involved, a big part of the motivation is to support and contribute to the patient safety mission. So speaking very much for our company and the way we approach things and the way our people approach things, we work with a team of highly experienced industry professionals who spent their years or their careers working on delivering value for companies in industry. And the opportunity to get involved in a REMS program and to play a role in the patient safety mission is very motivating. It's important and it's very motivating. People enjoy doing this type of work and partnering with sponsor companies on this mission. A second and very important part of the interest set is around meeting or exceeding sponsor expectations. And Marc already touched on this. We certainly know as we get involved, and a lot of times when we get involved in a program, it's through an RFP process. And when you're working through that process, you have some of the information, but you don't necessarily have all of the information in terms of the journey that you're about to embark upon. And so it's very important to be able to align on certain parameters and expectations, which include the scope and deliverables. It includes the schedule, budget and cost, and expectations. Marc already touched upon continuous improvement. So these are all very important considerations. Again, a lot should become clear and known through the RFP and contracting process. But I always find it interesting as you ink the contract and get started that there's always a few other things that need to be worked out, and there's always a few surprises that we find as we get started in a new relationship. Another point here is around reputation and partner of choice, and I believe that this would be true for many, if not all, of the companies that provide services to REMS programs. Our reputation is paramount. We want to do a good job for the program. We want to do a good job for the sponsors that are involved in the REMS program. For it seems obvious, but there's so many reasons. One is we want to have renewals. We want to be invited back to continue to provide services to the program itself. But we also know that within this very closely knit industry, that the reputation you build for yourself in working on one program will determine whether or not you get invited to come back and provide services in other programs or not. Because many of the companies that are sponsors in one program are sponsors to other programs. So our reputation and our ability to deliver value and to meet our commitments is very important to us. And I include here earn a fair profit. I think, as Marc mentioned, there's always going to be financial and contractual considerations. We try to ensure as we get involved in any piece of business that we are looking at things from a fairness perspective. We want to do well for our sponsors. We know the importance of fair pricing so that we can be cost competitive with the other companies in the industry that are providing similar services. But we also don't want to necessarily fall under pressure to try to underbid the competition in the effort to win business, because that's a losing proposition for us and for the sponsor companies that we serve. So certainly from our perspective, whenever we embark on an opportunity, we'll always ensure that we're going to be able to earn a fair profit. And therefore, we're confident once we get started that we'll be able to deliver value for the sponsors as well as for ourselves. I'm still having trouble advancing the slide. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities. And we'll begin by talking about a few challenges. And I start with number one, requirements. And again, folks might say, requirements. Well, we have the REMS document, we have the REMS supporting documents, we have other supporting documents in terms of enrollment forms that speak to requirements for various aspects of the programs. All true. However, the requirements are not always clear when you get into the nitty-gritty details as programs operationalized. And it's also important to bear in mind that these key documents that are reflective of requirements and expectations in the FDA-approved documents were sometimes developed well before the program starts to operationalize. And when I say well before, it can be more than a year before things actually start to operationalize around a particular program. So there's things within those details that need to be fleshed out. There's also things related to milestone dates and service level expectations that probably are not captured in those documents that need to be discussed, agreed, and documented. So the requirement set is very important. I'll offer maybe even just a couple of examples for our audience members. Sometimes things are very, very clear in terms of what the requirements and expectations are for year one, but not necessarily what the expectations are for year two and beyond. So we need to take care to make sure as we're working through the program that we have an eye towards what's the ongoing operational requirement going to look like, not just the startup requirement. There are sometimes inconsistencies in terms and terminology. So a great example that I like to offer is when you think about in audit and non-compliance programs, the terms critical, major, and minor. Well, sometimes in certain parts of the REMS, you'll see the word significant introduced. And there's always questions about, well, what's significant? Is that a critical? Is that a major? Is that both critical and major? Sometimes these things, again, need to be fleshed out as we get started with the program. And sometimes there's issues around completeness and comprehensiveness. Again, I'll probably draw an example to non-compliance plans that are generally part of the REMS supporting documents. The requirements around patient safety specific issues are generally very clear. But when you look at the broader scope of things that we as service providers that are involved in audit and non-compliance management need to deal with, there's sometimes shades of gray. So an example might be an issue around the stakeholder's ability to maintain an authorized representative. And that'll usually be very clear in the requirement set that stakeholders need to do this. But what if they don't? And what if we determine that there's a clear gap in the amount of time or in a period of time where that stakeholder did not have an authorized representative in place? Either the person left, the responsibility was not properly transitioned, etc. Well, what are the consequences of that? And then how do we need to deal with that in the non-compliance management process? Sometimes the requirements are clear and sometimes they're not. So those are a few examples. Another challenge pertains to the multiple service provider models. And I think Marc did a very nice job on his slide outlining a number of the potential service areas where service providers could get involved. And while it may seem clear on the surface of the different roles and responsibilities that service providers need to play and how they need to interface with each other, there usually are, again, it's the devil's in the details on these things. And when you get into those details, sometimes there isn't always clarity around who's doing what, the potential for duplication of effort or misalignment around activities. I'll again offer an example where when we've done audit services and we ask a number of questions, and sometimes it's through surveys, sometimes it's through various audit meetings, but a particular question may be a trigger for the stakeholder to realize, oh, you know what, we didn't do that. We need to complete that activity to get current with that responsibility. They called the REMS administrator or the contact center to do their appropriate follow-up. And in doing so, they may be cited with a non-compliance event by the REMS administrator or the contact center. Well, in turn, if we're doing the audit, we may similarly cite a non-compliance to that same stakeholder for the same event. So now you have duplication of activity, duplication of burden upon the stakeholder, and potentially duplication of data that's going to roll up through the REMS assessment report. So it's important, again, to make sure that there's clarity around the model and who's doing what amongst the various service providers that are involved. And my third major bullet point here is around schedule and lead times. Again, especially in multi-sponsor programs, in single shared programs, where all the sponsors need to have the opportunity to review, comment, and ultimately sign off on work products and deliverables and, of course, contracts. Well, this leads to a certain amount of time and delay, and potentially there can be impact on other operational activities that need to be performed that are dependent upon those reviews and sign-offs. This is especially true in contracts. I've kind of told myself whenever we're involved in contractual discussions, we need to generally allow 2 months to work through that contract process, because there's generally a lot of back and forth along the way. Okay, if I could again get help to go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so what are the opportunities? And there are a number of things, I think, that are starting to happen or that have happened that represent best practices. Well, one is the inclusion of a mobilization and development phase. And this doesn't have to be a very long period of time. It could be 4 to 8 weeks in time frame. A lot depends on the complexity of the program and everything that needs to be built into the service that's being performed by the service provider. But as we at Compliance Architects approach these activities, we outline a number of key deliverables that are produced in conjunction with this activity. One is a well-defined requirements trace matrix. So again, we certainly rely on documents that exist within the program, the REMS document, the supporting document, other artifacts, but we will build out a trace matrix that shows what those requirements are, where they originated, how they've been built into our process and service program design, so that it's clear to all the sponsors exactly how we're executing and why. Second, we want to have well-defined processes with clearly defined responsibilities across the service provider. So we will look to outline a number of key activities, especially around inputs and outputs, that show who's doing what we're doing, our points of interface, how those interfaces are facilitated through either reports, data sets, etc., where the role of the PMO comes into play if we're working with a program management office in providing our services, etc. And alignment on the schedule and milestones and service level definitions. Again, sometimes things aren't entirely clear as we get started, so it's important to know if we sometimes work backwards, for example, on an audit program, well, where's the data cutoff for the information that needs to be reported as part of the REMS assessment process? And how far in advance of that do we need to complete our final round of audit and still allow time for completion of non-compliance and CAPA activity, things of that nature. The second major bullet is around the use of enabling technology to help automate data collection and workflow. So traditionally, if you think about audit programs, they're conducted in person. There's auditors, one or more auditors that travel to a particular stakeholder location to execute against a predefined agenda, collect documents, review documents, and render a compliance judgment and an opinion on a level of compliance. And while that may still occur in certain places, we're finding increasingly that remote audit processes are more the standard. I believe that COVID-19 helped accelerate the process into remote auditing. And increasingly, we're finding the ability to introduce the use of survey technology to help streamline the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the audit. So what I mean by that is if you consider the set of questions and the set of information that normally needs to be collected and reviewed, there's a lot that can be done, obviously, by getting the documents and reviewing the documents themselves, documents and records. But a well-designed survey that asks very specific questions, either yes/no questions or multiple choice questions, can provide the auditor an incredible amount of helpful information as they get started to immediately have a sense of how compliant or not compliant a particular stakeholder is. So survey technology is incredibly important, in my opinion, as part of helping to enable and streamline audit services for these programs. And similarly for non-compliance notifications in CAPA, the more traditional form or process is to have a standard form that gets used by the auditor or the person who's involved in supporting the non-compliance plan, email that out or send that out to the stakeholder. They then need to submit a CAPA plan within a certain period of time. That gets evaluated, and we track the completion of those items. But if you're dealing with a large set of data, if there's a large, I'll say a greater than normal level of non-compliance that exists within a program, this can become a very cumbersome activity if it's being done through email and form-based methodologies. And there are a lot of great solutions out there. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the companies like Viva and TrackWise and ETQ, and there's a lot of other smaller vendors as well that provide very cost-efficient non-compliance and CAPA management solutions. And in turn, they can provide a lot of speed and efficiency when it comes to the collection and analysis of data. And finally, governance is a very important point. And our experience has certainly been that this doesn't usually take a lot of selling. Sponsors and service providers alike understand the importance of effective governance. Usually there's questions about how frequently governance forums need to convene to review issues, completed work products, consolidated results of information, etc. But those are details that can be worked through. There needs to be, coming out of the governance process, visibility to the schedule, the issues, and of course key performance metrics that are governing the results. Why don't we move to the next slide? Okay, and Marc, I'm going to transition it back to you because I think it makes sense for our audience to hear from you, I think, as part of the summary and wrap-up of our conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jerry, for sharing your insights on this topic. It was, well, your insights were insightful, to say the least. Anyhow, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. In summary, when we engage with service providers, we need to build strong and reliable partnerships. And these partnerships are critical for ensuring patient safety and REMS program compliance. Taking the time and effort to create a partnership versus a transactional relationship, in my opinion, is critical to successful engagements. And once you get to that point, all of those barriers and challenges that Jerry was speaking to previously, those barriers start to come down, and you're able to flesh out what is really needed in order to design, implement, and operationalize a well-designed REMS program. REMS service providers can also provide many benefits to sponsors, including providing dedicated resources, this longitudinal or institutional knowledge that we talk about of working across many different programs, many different sponsors, many different risks. And a lot of times vendors or service providers have the capital to invest in new technologies that can improve our REMS processes and systems that may take a great deal of time to do in-house. So there are many, many benefits to engaging with service providers. And finally, if you haven't picked up on this, and I want to I continue to emphasize it, maybe too much, but to accomplish our REMS goals, both sponsors and service providers need to clearly define our needs from a contracting perspective, the needs from the REMS program as it relates to our regulatory needs, the needs of our REMS as it relates to our stakeholders, right? We need to develop and implement programs that not only reduce burden, but also provide access. So we need to think of, there's many stakeholders out there, both internal and external, that we need to take into consideration when we build out our programs. And when both the service providers and sponsors understand that there's these other needs, we can begin to create that environment for sharing of ideas and ultimately build that trust, which then leads to a partnership. And at the end of the day, once those needs are defined, we can monitor our REMS program's performance and improve upon our systems, processes, and procedures as needed for our stakeholders. And with that being said, we are about 5 to 6 minutes out from the end of our time here. So we would like to thank you all for joining us today. I had a great time partnering with Jerry, not only in our previous engagements, but also in this opportunity to present today. And at this time, I see Jamie has rejoined us. We will now open the floor for any questions and answers that we can provide. You're on
Jamie,
mute.
we can't hear you. You're on mute. There you go.
I am. Sorry about that. Thanks, Mark and Jerry, for the very, very insightful presentation. And as the questions are rolling in, this is something that really, really is relevant to so many of the people on the call today. So the first question we have from Cal Ahurgi. What's the role of KPIs and KQIs in demonstrating the level of services provided by the vendor? And what is the impact of these measures on the relationships between the sponsors and vendors? Great question, Cal.
Jerry, do you want to?
You want me to start here?
If you would like, or I can start. Or you take it, and then I'll see if I can add.
Well, because I think whenever we're talking about metrics, these are important because they should be, the definition should be, first of all, shared and agreed between the sponsors and the vendors, because they should be representative of how we're going to view and measure performance of the service. There should be important metrics as it relates to timeliness, around completeness, around cost and effort. Because again, as we embark upon a relationship, there are a lot of assumptions that are generally built in terms of how things are going to work. And a key part of the governance that we establish is to make sure that those assumptions are valid. And we're trying to make sure that the metrics, in fact, show that, yes, these assumptions are valid. We're operating to plan or not. And if we're not, again, the role of governance becomes how do we make the appropriate adjustments? Marc?
Yeah, and I think to add to that, when we go through the exercise of defining KPIs or KQIs, we need to set these expectations in reality. And a lot of times we have this aspirational goal and we have these preconceived outcomes that we want to achieve. And when you have that bias built into when you're into these KPIs and KQIs, it can create a lot of tension between sponsors and service providers. And so I think first thing is to, one, set expectation or set realistic expectations related to the KPIs and KQIs, especially for new programs, right? We have to understand that there's always going to be change, right? Nothing's going to be static. We're always going to be, there's going to be a new learning every day. And if you don't think there's going to be a new learning every day, you're going to have the complexities in defining what is success. And so I think going into the KPIs and KQIs with an open mind to set realistic expectations and then managing to those expectations, right? We're good at setting expectations. We're not always good at managing to them. And managing requires, that relationship where you can have a conversation with your service provider, or a service provider having a conversation with the sponsor that maybe a KPI or KQI wasn't defined appropriately, and we need to adjust them. And so they don't need to necessarily be static. They could be dynamic in nature, but I think that's what that building this relationship and this trust and this partnership allows us to do, is to explore how to add more value to what we initially designed.
No, I think that's a great point, Mark, about making sure to remember to build agility into this relationship,
Mhm.
and that, no REMS program is ever going to be static the way that it was approved on day one, and that, maintaining that and being able to pivot quickly is really critical. Great answers. We have one more. We have time for one more from Jamie Richter. How should sponsors running RFP processes think about the balance and trade-offs between vendor or partner quality and qualifications versus the big elephant in the room all the time, costs? So you all's insight into that. Mark, did you want to go first since Jerry started the last one?
Yeah, I think that's probably only fair. I wrote a couple notes down here, and I could probably talk about this topic for about another 3 hours. But, Jerry made an interesting point about earning a fair profit and the complexities of going through a multi-vendor RFP process, right? At the end of the day, the bottom line is the bottom line. If you have multiple sponsors or multiple service providers that have disparate service costs, like you really have to wonder what's going on. Why are the costs so different that one service provider is over here in this stadium, and then there's a whole nother service provider that's in a totally different sporting event? They're not even in the same sport. They're like in Hollywood or wherever they are. But how are the RFPs being evaluated and presented in such different ways? And it really does come down to money. And when we start putting pressure testing these programs against cost, I have seen, and we probably all have seen, this unintended consequence of the perpetual change request. And those change requests create a lot of strain. I have a budget I have to adhere to every year. When I get my budget, I have to fit my service providers into those budgets. When I have to go back to my management and beg for more money, they don't, that's a complex conversation. And so when you have these, when you get into these contracts where you have maybe competitive bidding or trying to weigh the quality versus the quantity, it's not always the cheapest is the best. You really have to look at what the overall definition or what you've defined as your needs and how those needs ultimately can be measured, to Cal's point, and acted upon in a way that allows your program to be not interrupted. I think a lot of times we think, we can just make a change. Not for most REMS programs, you just can't make a change. That's almost impossible. There's systems, there's validated systems, there's stakeholder continuity of messaging, all these things that need to be taken into account. And, you just can't change things because we didn't clearly define them. So I think when we really break it down, it goes back to those initial conversations of, when I'm taking those conversations back internally, I'm really asking my colleagues, hey, is the cost and the trade-offs between what they're offering, are they equivalent, or are we not asking the right things from a sponsor in our RFP? What was the reason that they came back so different indeed? And that's something that we have to, as sponsors, take back and look at on our as we develop these RFPs, whether or not they're precise and accurate enough to actually get the information or give the information to our service providers to appropriately scope our needs. So that was probably a long way of saying you probably need to be careful.
Can I add just a little bit? I know we're a couple minutes past time, Jamie, but just to, as a service provider, when we're approaching the activity of putting together a proposal and a competitive proposal in conjunction with a program offering, we want to hit the mark both in terms of the solution and also in terms of price. And those are two different things as we go about our activity. They're, of course, interdependent, but we start by thinking about the solution. We really pour over the details that are provided in the RFP documents and any other supporting documents to make sure we understand as clearly as possible what the sponsors are expecting. We also place a lot of importance on that Q&A process that's generally built in to make sure that we submit good questions. And we take a lot of interest in the responses that come back to our questions as well as to other service provider questions that have been asked in the process. And we try to really hit the mark as far as the solution. It's funny hearing Marc talk about, different sports and whatnot, because we're trying to make sure that at least from a solution standpoint that we're on target. And then it does become a question of how are we pricing? And I think we try very hard to be cost efficient and cost effective. We don't try to throw a resource at a particular task that's well more than what the program needs. We try to be appropriate in our resource planning and allocation. So it does come down to that. At the end of the day, we've certainly been involved in processes where we've been told you're too expensive, you're outside the budget. What can you do? Give us your best and final. And we'll listen and do our best. But at the end of the day, if we don't get selected, we'll tip our hat and just say, I'm sorry, we can't meet your cost requirements or your budget requirements.
Well, thank you both for this very insightful session. It's something that we all will eventually deal with, if not currently dealing with, and maybe some people are going through a vendor change. There's always lots of evolution and change and requirement changes that might even come from the agency. And so this was great insight into how to approach that and how to make sure that these relationships, expectations, and agility really stay in place so that you're not stressed out every day about your program. Yeah. Thanks both.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.